G'day, Michael. How are you today, mate?
I'm great, brother. Like I was just saying before we recorded, I'm excited to be on the show to connect with a community that's a little bit different, probably, from the core community that listens to my show. But I think there's a lot of surprising overlap, too.
Yeah, definitely. So, Michael, you host the podcast Third Eye Drops, where you host mind melds with interviews with a wide variety of guests, authors, musicians, discussing all sorts of topics of, I would say, esoteric, spirituality, philosophy, all a wide variety of topics covered that delve into some technology. And listening to some of those podcasts, there was a great conversations that you had on things like play and knowledge and communication and learning that I thought there would be great crossover to martial arts. And then I've also found out that you too yourself have a background in martial arts. So was it karate that you had grown up participating in?
Yeah. So not like traditional karate, but more like, I guess, what I've heard called American karate. So it's weird because some of the terminology we used was Korean. Like we would use like chumbi stance and stuff like that. So it's this weird American hybridized thing, you know?
Yeah, and so you said you'd create you did get your black belt in that.
I did, yeah.
And I guess take me through, some of your experiences and training and how you would find them, in the realm of play or learning, what kind of things have stuck out for you in that realm?
Yeah, so I mean, my initial interest was sort of one of those things I chalk up to an odd twist of character fate, where I remember being young and seeing martial arts depicted on TV. Like I was obsessed with ninja movies. I was born in the 80s. I'm guessing you too probably. And I'm sure you remember all those old ninja movies like American Ninja,
classic.
The Sho Kosugi movies. I'm trying to remember some of what his big ones were. But then of course like Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris, and then obviously ninjas really started penetrating the zeitgeist in cartoons like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And I cannot explain why, but that shit captivated me. And I saw it and I was immediately like, what is this? I need to know more. I don't know why, but I love this. And then I learned, ninjas come from Japan, and then there's also samurai, and then there's these various martial arts. So I think that's what led me down that path initially. But in terms of play, there is some really rich, interesting, fertile ground here, because when it comes to acquiring any skill, martial arts or anything, like I also grew up playing music, everything at first is just so hard. It's so clunky, it's so mechanical, and you rep it over and over and over and over again until it's just automatic. And then suddenly, once you get to this point of, the rote memorization and the muscle memory, that's when play actually opens up. Because play, in a way, it's like play precedes everything. Like, you play karate, you play martial arts. I did all of that. But you don't really fully play until you've mastered to an extent. And then that's where it gets really interesting, I think.
Yeah, so it's like learning the foundations or the rules of whatever skill or sport it is you're learning. In that process of those initial learning, it's going to be play because you don't know what you're doing, so you're just experimenting and trying different things. But then once you do have some foundation, then you can build off of those rules that have been set, and then I guess eventually even look to break some of those rules.
Yeah, exactly. And you know this so much better than I do with your accomplishments. It's like you don't really like playfulness, and being able to play requires a kind of freedom where you're not thinking. It's the same. It's kind of like being in flow as well. And like I'm sure you're very well acquainted with flow states, at least anecdotally, and through personal experience. But what they find neurologically in a flow state is that you're actually in a state called transient hypofrontality. And what that means is the thinking part of your brain where you conceive of self and how you look and what you're doing, that part of your brain turns off. And you're in this more blown open, like, you know, completely in the moment, egoless space where you are really just playing. You are kind of pushing boundaries, and you can't get to that place without the requisite skill. So it's like weird. You have to get the skill to be able to access this other dimension. And I do think that is a dimension of play. It's like a deeper kind of play.
And that's what I think it feels with martial arts a lot of the time, especially grappling. But it does feel like you are connecting to a deeper sense of play because you know that it's something that humans have done since they've been able to move. We can still see animals engaging, in play, chimps, all sorts of mammals will,
totally.
And nature to it that is so important. And that we oftentimes, in the modern society kind of shun or looked down on or are expected to grow out of it as well. So but it seems like it brings it back to that deeper level of play.
Yeah. Yeah. And you were saying before that you feel like, I think you're kind of hinting at it now, that right before we recorded, you were saying that you feel like jiu-jitsu in particular is a very playful martial art. Like, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying this because I don't, I can see why you would say that, but as someone with little to no grappling experience, that's not coming from me. But I think that's a very astute observation from what I've seen and what you just said about animals too. I mean, man, I have 2 cats and I'll send you some footage and you can let me know what belt level you think they're at. But, but yeah, I think it is endemic, and it is part of, like, it is probably one of the oldest play languages there is like the pushing of one physical body against another physical body. Like, it's older than culture, it's older than the human species probably. So there are some really deep roots there. And what's incredible is that it seems like it's still evolving too. Like, it still seems like, it's not like, how can you have something that's existed for hundreds of thousands or millions of years and it's still evolving? Like, that's pretty remarkable and mind-blowing. Like, I told you I'm a fan of mixed martial arts. I've even nerded out on jiu-jitsu a bit and fantasized about doing it myself. And it's clear, like, the guys now that are pushing the envelope, that are the cutting edge, they're still clearly innovating.
Yeah, definitely. It is amazing that you do mention that being one of the oldest things, activities that humans are partaking in terms of play. I like the term used there, play languages. There could be difference. That in recent years, say 5 or so, just accelerated probably by technology as well and the spread of information. There has been just such a massive upgrading in, like, knowledge and techniques and skills that's happened all around the world, just all at the same time. So there is also that level of play and intricacies and depth to it has been partially driven forward also by the technology of the internet and video recordings, and then that sharing of knowledge as well has just been so accelerated.
Yeah. And there's this, this is where it starts to get a bit into the mythological and the allegorical, because there's always this like rhythm of structure and play. And I think the reason jiu-jitsu seems to be growing now is the structure was questioned and tested enough to understand the things that didn't work. So obviously MMA has had a huge role in this in terms of, like, proving out, early days stuff where it was this style against that style. And clearly what you wound up seeing was all of this cultural baggage that was not really doing anything in a lot of the traditional martial arts. So they cut all that shit out and they kept what worked. And jiu-jitsu was a huge part of what worked. But even probably still within jiu-jitsu, there were certain parts of that paradigm that were just window dressing or stylistic, or there was no reason they had to be that way. And now there's huge incentive for people to figure out what those things are and what the weaknesses are and how to polish it to a honed edge. And I mean, that's what you see people doing now, is they've like just cut out all the stuff that doesn't work, and they're looking for just the things that do work. And I think that leads to what I was talking about before, that rhythm of structure in play, where the old paradigm gets overturned and the new comes in. And it seems like the new is coming in a really noticeable way from what I know, at least.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea that it's, that removal of certain parts will actually then open up, new avenues of exploration.
Yeah.
It's not just the things are moving forward all the time and things are progressing, but it is actually that shedding of certain baggage, as you mentioned, is like not necessarily negative things, but just perhaps things that have been outgrown their usefulness. They probably served a purpose at one point, but then being no longer serving that purpose, so they're thrown to the side, and in their place new things can continue to grow and develop.
Yeah And the reason I said that this is starting to border on the mythological is because one of my favorite myths, and if you've heard some of my ramblings on this in other pods before, you may have heard this story, but one of my favorite myths is the myth of baby Hermes stealing the sacred cattle. Do you know this story at all?
I haven't heard this one, no.
So this is like the perfect distillation of this idea that I was talking about, of like the sort of interplay of structure and play. And the myth is basically, you have baby Hermes, he's essentially a bastard son of Zeus, and he's being raised by, I think his mother was like a nymph or some other, semi divine creature. So he was not a normal baby. Like, he had full intellect. He was up walking around having complicated thoughts. And one morning he wakes up and decides, I want to eat meat. But I don't want to just eat meat. I want to eat the best meat. So I've heard, he thinks to himself, that Apollo's cattle is the best meat. But this is like sacred cattle, untouchable. They're supposed to be immortal. Like, you're absolutely not supposed to eat this cattle. But if it's the best, that's what I want. So he hatches this scheme, and there's all these little antics on the way. But long story short, he ends up luring the cattle out. He ends up sacrificing a bunch of cattle. And I guess it's customary to, when you do that, you sacrifice to the Olympian gods. But he includes himself amongst the pantheon of gods. It's a sacrilegious act in so many ways. He steals this divine cattle, sacrifices to himself, and then eventually Apollo figures out what's going on. And everybody kind of knows Apollo as the sun god, but he's really more than that. He's considered like also the oracle god, and because he's supposed to be like the manifestation of light, it's like he sees everything. He's tapped right into the divine mind of Zeus. You're not supposed to be able to trick him in any way. Yet this little baby is tricking him somehow. So he realizes, like, this is another god that's tricking me. Like, this has to be some other kind of divine being that's tricking me. Otherwise, this would make no sense. So he eventually catches the little Hermes, his whole trickster antics. And he's like, I know what you did. I'm going to bring you in front of Zeus now, and he's going to have your ass, basically. And they tell the whole story, and Zeus just thinks it's funny. And he's like, man, like, I'm sorry, but this is hilarious. But on the other hand, you did break a bunch of laws. So you two either need to make peace, or you are going to get a punishment. So depending on the version of the story, there's a little bit of a difference to the ending, but it always ends with Apollo and Hermes making peace, and Apollo actually giving Hermes the Asclepius staff, the staff of, not the staff of Asclepius, sorry, the caduceus with the two snakes, and that's the symbol of being, divine Olympian. So the reason I tell this whole long convoluted story is because it's a story about how play and completely challenging and actually insulting the status quo actually leads to innovation. And eventually, not only does it lead, the thing that challenged it and came from the outside becomes a part of the new establishment. So Hermes, with his like rebellious energy, defies the establishment, then becomes a part of the establishment. So this is what I mean about this rhythm between play and structure, is like eventually like this, there's this monolithic structure, this traditional way you have to do everything, but then eventually that hermetic trickster energy comes in and it challenges it and overturns it, and then it gets absorbed by the structure. But then it happens all over again, over and over and over again, in so many different ways. So yeah, long, convoluted story, but I love it every time I see an example of it in the real world.
It's very much so. I can think of some now where martial artists who have come in and been revolutionary, in their games, and some in jiu-jitsu, say 10, 15 years ago. It doesn't seem that long ago, but now when the newer breed would consider them old, and they're old hat now. And even though their game was revolutionary at the time, now if you were to refer to it, you could still refer to it with respect, but it's also seen as passé, as they have become the old guard, what once was new. So I think there's definitely that overlap there that we can see now, and it's constantly going, because there's still the people coming in who are brand new, and that at some point, eventually, the same thing will happen to them.
Yeah. Like I remember, like a mundane example. Like I remember hearing that leg locks were like really taboo, and like people didn't like them for whatever reason for a long time. And now if you watch like any jiu-jitsu, that seems like what everybody's trying to do constantly. It's just like dudes rolling around trying to wrench each other's legs.
Yeah, 100%. That's something that it just exploded in the last I'd say 5 years or so, and again just driven forward by technology, and just once instructionals and everything started getting produced, it just absolutely exploded and changed the game. And due to it being seen as somewhat forbidden or frowned upon, neglected in somewhat, just in a cultural way, people just looked down upon them, but they really worked. So they became undeniable.
Yeah. So how did that work in terms of like, they weren't expressly illegal? It was just almost like a gentleman's agreement that I'm not going to try to like rip your ACL or something, like, or
yeah. So there's a couple of, like, there was a saying that the choke is the king, the armbar is the queen, and the footlock is the dirty thief. There was some that it was frowned upon, and there's also some one of the reasons for that is that in the early days of the Gracie schools in Brazil, there was a rival school. I believe it was Oswaldo Fada's school, and Oswaldo Fada did specialize in footlocks, and apparently they had a duel, school versus school, and the Gracies took a lot of losses via footlocks, and so there's some hinting that they were looked down upon because of that. They beat us with that, but that's a cheap move. It's a dirty tactic. But I would think also just there is the nature of what they can do to your legs and feet, and just the catastrophic injuries that they could cause, perhaps if surgery is not as readily available and as good as it is today, that it would just be looked down upon like that. But there is that those early interactions that could have just set that cultural thing in place that then just got carried on for so long. I always like to play this game of trying to prognosticate about what the next thing will be, and I guess I don't know enough about jiu-jitsu to know now what's taboo, if anything. I mean, other than like, obviously you can't just like go in there and grab a guy's nuts or something like that, but maybe someday, maybe someday could be neck locks, neck cracks.
Okay.
Just ripping on people's necks.
I was gonna say that's a business opportunity for you, man. You have the first school where you legalize ball grabs. That's
But then the other thing is you got to keep students enrolled and wanting to learn it. So
yeah, you'd get
that's
a certain
always a
kind of
trick.
clientele, a
You
certain
would.
like a lot of one, yeah.
But so you mentioned the story of Hermes there, and doing my research for this, one of the things that I heard you talk about was Hermes Trismegistus, and in their relation to the nature of play. Now, my understanding is that Hermes is the Greek god, who was also or is also a huge martial art, and again, I'd put it in line with jiu-jitsu as a grappling sport, and is one of the earliest ones that we know of recorded. We've got Jacob wrestling an angel in the Bible.
Yeah.
So it just entwined with human culture so much. But then there is also Hermes Trismegistus, which I believe is a Egyptian deity. But can you explain, I guess, and I'm sure there's a lot in there, but I guess their relation then to play, and I know they also become important in terms of knowledge and communication and learning.
Yeah, man, this is such an incredibly deep rabbit hole, and there's a lot of real history here, but also a lot of legend and a lot of things that are just obscured and, rumor and things that are lost to time and whatever. So I guess the first I'll just kind of explain like this. Oh, something just fell down. And this Hermes Trismegistus figure, and then I'll connect the dots as to how the different deities sort of connect with one another and whether or not they're the same or not. So Hermes Trismegistus, I might be saying this wrong. I've heard it pronounced a few different ways, but so he is this legendary figure who is supposedly this ancient Egyptian with nous, which is like the mind of God, like the divine mind. And if you read a text like the Divine Pymander, there's this whole story about him. I believe he's like wandering in the desert, and then he ends up having this vision of the divine mind coming to him as this giant, like flaming dragon. And they kind of mind meld and lock minds, and he gives him the whole download on the cosmos and why reality was created, what humans are, what the point of being human is, how you transcend from your humanity back to the mind of God. And then he's telling his student the tale of this. Like, that's what's going on in this divine Pymander text. So then you have this whole other corpus of writings that are called the Hermetica, or the Hermetic texts, like I think around like 14 to 1500 or something like that. They're rediscovered, but they're purported to be much older, probably a couple thousand years old, maybe older. I don't think we really know for sure how old the oldest texts are. And then a lot of people have probably heard about like the Emerald Tablet, which is this very short, very cryptic text that's talking about this it's sort of a lot of people, they may have heard the phrase as above, so below. That's not a direct translation, but that more or less comes from this Emerald Tablet text. So even there, it's pretty convoluted. But as to how this Hermes Trismegistus being connects with the Greek god Hermes, it starts to actually liked something that we hate today, which is syncretism. So they liked to look for deities in their own pantheons that were the same or similar, and then they liked to put them together. So the Egyptians and the Greeks saw a similarity between Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. So Thoth is known for being like this wise sage who invented language and writing, and like the patron vocation of Thoth was the scribe. So like the person who mastered language and was synthesizing language. So this is sort of like the being of symbols and knowledge and language. And he's also associated with the moon. And he also does have some trickstery qualities. Like there are stories about him I'm trying to remember the exact myth, but he does something like he rigs a game or something in his favor, being, you know, kind of clever and underhanded. So then how this connects to Hermes is like, it's debatable. So, you know, some people will say that it's pure syncretism, like they're like it's just the two cultures deciding these two things seem the same, so we'll just sort of put them together. And then there are other people who really believe that there was a mutual understanding that this was really a different of the same being. And then there's another layer to it when you bring Hermes Trismegistus into it, because it's like, is this Hermes Trismegistus character the same as the Greek god Hermes, or is it not? And there's debate around that as well. And I think if you start going down the rabbit hole, it's hard to not start constructing a story that does bring them all together. And in my mind, they are sort of all together, but that could be a reach on my part too. So it is convoluted. There's a whole deep rabbit hole, and I'm not even scratching the surface of the rabbit hole, by the way. But that's sort of just, that's like sort of a background of who this character is. But it's really interesting to me how this one archetype, this sort of trickster, sage, information-based, play-based, wisdom-based, really endured through the ages. And like, you go on YouTube, there's going to be hundreds of videos about Hermes Trismegistus. There's tons of books published every year. Like, people are obsessed with this character, and I kind of am too. It seems like you're interested too. Yeah. And it's very curious. It's very curious how he stays around the zeitgeist.
Yeah, and something interesting that I just remembered while you were saying that is that there is on the tombs of an Egyptian pyramid, I believe, or the tomb of Basquiat, there is a full hieroglyphic depiction of a wrestling match as well. Starts with someone dropping a rag to signify the match. They've got full holds that we still use today, so that we know that it was, you know, obviously a cultural thing going back to that day as well, as and of course it being prevalent in Greek culture. And so I wonder if, you know, when we talk about the Hermes nature of play and, you know, and trickster capabilities, do you feel, is that something that gets invoked when we are, you know, when we are involved in that ourselves, or is it's symbolic of that when we're engaged in those activities? Or how do you think that relates to our own experience of play?
Yeah. So the way that I make this make a little more sense and make it a bit more practical is there's some work by people like Carl Jung and James Hillman, who are these, they're these psychologists / psychiatrists. Jung was a psychiatrist who really took these ideas of myth seriously and understood that they were satisfying some kind of very primary archetypal role in the human psyche, and that these weren't just stories, these were somehow connected to the way human beings endemically think and function in the world. And I think particularly this archetype of Hermes, Hillman, this psychologist, he believed we were living in like the time of our obsession with, you know, information, right? Like, I mean, everything we're doing right now is, these computers are running off of stacks of information. You and I are exchanging ideas and information. Even you could say grappling is an exchange of information. It's a competition of information. And you can start to see already how this could link back to this archetypal being, right? Like this being that likes novelty and jokes and speed and, you know, playing, and all of these things sort of lead back to this same kind of archetypal feature of, you could say, I guess, the world, you could say the psyche, the universe. I don't know how far back it stretches, but I think that we can safely say that we're scratching some sort of archetypal itch in the human psyche. Like, there's something that we just like, you know? It's like it's the same thing like when you're watching a sport, and whether it's martial arts or another sport, and you're captivated. And, you know, if it's an MMA match, there's always that chance there's going to be a round 5, 4-minute and 50-second head kick knockout. And we love nothing more than that. And there's always a chance for a Hail Mary in American football. And there's always a chance for, 10 strikes in a row in bowling or whatever it is. And all of these are like the height of novelty, right? Like they're all the height of the unexpected happening. And I don't think we can say why we like it or why it exists, but it does. It definitely does. And we can't get enough of it. We just can't get enough of it. It's like sports are the most watched televised event, I think, every year in probably every country, whether, it's football / soccer in Europe or South America, or it's, American football. And I just think that I don't think you can go deeper than saying it's archetypal. Like, it's just with us. As we were pointing out before with wrestling and grappling, it's the very first tribe of human beings. I'm sure when their tribe was walking through the wilderness and they came across another tribe, one of the very first thoughts they had was, I wonder if I could fucking pin that guy. And that's just one version of it. That's just one iteration of it. But I think it's just something that's part and parcel of the human experience, and it's a mystery as to why, for sure.
Yeah, and this is where it gets interesting for me, because as you mentioned, like, the nature of just information and play is there's a lot of thoughts now that in the realm of motor learning that play and direct experience is going to be the best way to actually learn new skills. And some people go so far as to say that's the only way, but there's an existing model of just gathering information itself and just having the most pre-existing knowledge and consuming that as being a proven way to learn things. So by looking at what's been learned and replicating that as best as you can as a proven and established way of doing things, we know that does work. But the push now coming from motor learning is that you can replicate those same learnings, but through direct experience and through play. So instead of taking the knowledge that's already available, you look to set up parameters of constraints, and then through playing games within those constraints, you can experience or discover for your own those same learnings that you may have been told about otherwise. Mm-hmm. And so there's this idea now that they're more efficient because it becomes more into becomes part of you, or is taken into your intuition quicker, or comes from your intuition, rather than sitting down and just repeating the information that's already known. So there's this idea now that that's backed by motor learning, that the using play and using those games is actually a more. So is that something that that's touched upon in terms of the generation of new knowledge being a more efficient or a way to experience through play?
I don't know, but I'm intrigued by this, because it's essentially like, I guess the juxtaposition would be a really well-established curriculum and way of doing things in a very systematic way versus just throwing someone in the pool. And I guess to use an easy example, we'll stick with jiu-jitsu because that's what you know so well. So this would be like, instead of learning this technique and drilling and really structured, you're talking about just like getting on the mat and just going for it, right? And like learning through being in the position and seeing if you can intuitively figure out how to get out, or how to submit someone or whatever, versus be guided.
Yeah. But the idea then becomes that the instructor would potentially have those outcomes already in mind. And instead of telling the person exactly what those outcomes are, they would restrict their options, or give them finer parameters until they can produce the outcomes that they're intending. So it would be throwing them in there, but then giving them such guidelines to the game that they're confident that they will discover the intended outcome on their own. So it's that interplay between that structure and play itself that's really that's really what they're trying to develop.
So would that mean maybe like if you had a student who was a blue belt and a student who was a white belt, and for the blue belt, you say you have to choke him, and the white belts just don't get choked? Like, would it be kind of like that, where you're giving them these parameters where like, yeah.
That would be a start, but it would also be like you can only use your legs, or you have to. So like an old school one that they used to do was they would tuck their hands in their belts, and they could only use their legs to prevent someone from passing guard or trying to attack. And the idea that then that would develop the leg skills with your legs quicker, but then they can get even finer, like you get started in a position and your elbow is not allowed to move past a certain point, or you're only allowed to try and go for a certain position or move your elbow into a certain place. And that just by even those finer restrictions, that the movements that will develop from that then become those ideally well-established techniques, or just learned, those techniques will be learned faster. So it's like, one way I look at it is potentially like like haiku, where the restriction in the format of writing will kind of allow that creativity to happen, except in this case they're looking for a desired outcome.
Totally. Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, structure, you even in a game you need a structure, right? Like, it can't just be completely open-ended. Like, a good game has a good structure, and there's a right amount of open-endedness, and there's an amount of open-endedness that's like too much. Like I don't want to, like, do you play video games?
Yeah.
So yeah, I've always on and off throughout my whole life played video games, and like, I love an open world game, but if I don't feel like that game has a strong point, I'm like, why do I want to play this? There's not enough story structure, or maybe just, and there's a million other elements too, like maybe the gameplay's not good or something. So it's like, you always, even if it's an open world player, like the maximum feeling of freedom, there's still a level where it's too much, or vice versa. And I feel like skill acquisition is probably the same way. Like, when I learned how to play guitar when I was young, I didn't really learn. Like, I just figured it out, and it was like, how do people play this? Like, this sounds cool. How do I play this? And it was totally picking up the guitar. I look back on that and I know I absolutely did not learn in the most efficient way. So I think that I like open-endedness and I like freedom to an extent, but I always feel like there's a line somewhere where there needs to be guidance and structure and wisdom overlooking that process. Like, what is your philosophy on, do you I'm assuming you actively teach?
Yeah, so I mean that's where I will have some variation between those methods. So I will still do direct information, direct instruction sometimes when I feel it's necessary, and then sometimes I'll do completely games-based learning. But I feel like the structures that you will place around so many things to set up a class or a lesson to make it in their learning outcomes is so important. But there is that idea that if you just give the most well-established technique and that's it, get people to directly reproduce that, that is the most efficient way as well, and it will get results. But there is this drive for people to experience that more of because there is that draw to it. I think there's a bit of that allure to it, as you kind of mentioned. But I think as long as you have your outcomes in mind, and then you are meeting those outcomes in terms of a lesson, then that's a successful way.
So when I was doing martial arts, obviously it was very structured in terms of, like, if you want you're this belt and you want to get to this belt, you have to learn this form, you have to learn these techniques, and you have to. We had like a creed we had to learn, like a thing we would repeat. So you got to learn, like, you know, because I started in 5th grade and then went like up until college probably. But as a kid, you know, you're learning, like, you got to learn these techniques, and then you got to, you know, follow this philosophy and then do a test, and then we'll give you the belt. And I know jiu-jitsu is not like that at all. But I also am curious, like, what is there, does the philosophy of teaching and what, I know like a belt award in jiu-jitsu is much more subjective. It's like the teacher kind of decides, like, yeah, you're ready for your purple belt now or whatever. But I guess my question is, you've been around jiu-jitsu so much, you've been to so many different jiu-jitsu schools. Does that just widely vary, like all the way across the board? Like, would I have a totally different experience learning from you than I would if I went to some like Gracie school or...
Yeah, especially like even more so now is where things, you know, that there's been a kind of acceleration in that, where people are experimenting with these new ways of teaching and, you know, new ways of running classes and new curriculums. There are, you know, people are having discussions now, should we do away with belts entirely? They're just, you know, which I don't think will happen, but there's this constant push now to even shake up all the, you know, all the foundations that they could possibly think up, all the sacred cows that they could possibly gore.
Yeah. See, that's where that comes from, I think. I think that's where the sacred cow things come from, is that myth.
Yeah, and so there's every school will have its own guidance of what each belt rank will mean, and it's always kind of been a self-policed, subjective thing where you don't want to give out belts too fast because then your school will be looked down upon,
right?
And or you don't want to mess in as legit as possible, and that has just been a self-policed kind of mechanism where the community would look after itself. If someone gave themselves a fake belt or something like that, the community will call them out, kind of thing. So it's this kind of internal structure that's now again still being challenged.
Yeah, that is very interesting. So how do you approach, like, if I came in to learn from you, like, what would your approach be to like feeling out a new person?
So one of the most important things for me is to find out certain goals that you might particularly have in learning, because a lot of people will come to martial arts not necessarily, you know, just to learn an armbar or learn a leg lock. It's, you know, they want a place to go, a place to get fit, maybe build confidence.
Right.
And that can be more important than the actual techniques that you're teaching themselves to a lot of people. But of course, within a lesson, you still have to show a technique, and get them fit. And you want to show stuff that works too. So what I will do now with the beginners is kind of blend that line between direct instructions and games, where I'll still show a technique and get them to reproduce it, but then I'll put them into a game-based scenario, which is tightly controlled and restrictions on it that will give them a chance to reproduce that technique against a resisting opponent. And so you can see people, like, the sign of a good lesson is when you see people having fun doing that portion of it. You know, that's where it can really make an impact and make a difference. So after working them through a whole range of techniques and games like that, then at the end we can kind of put it all together in one big game that's combining those certain things that have been looked at, and that they could potentially get a chance to use those techniques in a final game. And that's really where I'm pushing or trying to push things at the moment, and trying to refine that as much as possible. But it is leaning onto that idea of play being the most valuable thing and trying to recreate that experience as much as possible.
Is that similar or different from how you learned personally?
Different. some similarities though, but the more traditional way would basically be a direct instruction of perhaps 3 techniques that you drill, and then half an hour of just free for all. So maybe half just direct instructions, and then half free for all, just go for it kind of thing. And then sometimes there would be some specific stuff in the middle. But if we look at it in a certain light, that was really how things were taking place.
Interesting. I wish I lived closer to you, man. I would definitely take lessons from you. I've wanted to start jiu-jitsu for a long time, and the main things that have turned me off are just not wanting to get injured. Because I get competitive, and I know that if I get competitive, especially like I'm still fairly fit and everything and active, but like at my age, I'm like, I could definitely fuck myself up. I know, like, I've already got nagging injuries. Like, I'm gonna get my right shoulder kimura that's already bothers me. Like, that's like the story I always tell myself, at least. And I've had a couple friends join different schools and be like, dude, come, and I've been so close, but I haven't done it.
Yeah, well, I mean, safety again is another thing that's very important. So the ability to, and that's where the games come in as well, is by confining things, you're able to reduce the risk of injury as well, while increasing people's ability to have fun. So that's where it becomes important. But I guess one of the overarching goals is to see people develop and change over time. So like that, we distill it as that building of confidence, but it really is ideally, a transformation in people's, character of the lessons that they've learned through martial arts that we can instill upon them. And it's funny thinking about it, just, how to design a good lesson or just make a good day, because that's just such a microcosm of the overall picture that you hope to achieve, where eventually, just through hard work and the relationships they build, the skills they learn, that they benefit from it greatly in other areas of their life. So there's that transformative effect too that I think is I assume is with other arts as well, like guitars, like playing guitar, as you mentioned.
Yeah, but the other thing that martial arts provides, like, probably, I think every sport does, every competitive sport does, but it really viscerally and ruthlessly forces you to lose and, like, understand that part of play is losing and understanding how to cope with loss. Like, I mean, man, like myself and every kid at my school, like the first time they would like go to a tournament and lose a sparring match, just almost all of them would cry, and then you see the maturity come from that, and like understanding how to both feel less afraid of losing and as a result freer when you're in the competitive play space. And then that for sure projects itself forward and choose to take leaps you otherwise would not have taken, because you understand, well, I've lost over and over and over again at this other thing, so I'm not really intimidated by starting a podcast or whatever it is, because you already have been over mountains with more visceral repercussions, and you've made it through that. So it kind of, like I said, it projects itself forward into other parts of your life. But I think that I think it's great to get involved in martial arts at any age in life, but I do sometimes take for granted that a lot of people had no competitive experience growing up, so they like never suffered a visceral loss growing up. And I don't think that's a good way to go through life. Like, I don't think it's good to grow up believing in some weird ego-based and like you're gonna graduate and find the perfect partner and find the perfect job and be happy. Like you gotta take some lumps along the way to be able to have that, I don't know, I guess like grit that you need just to make sense of a difficult life, and martial arts is just one of the best ways to do that.
Yeah. And so I mean, that's because there's a lot of that going. There's a
Oh,
lot
yeah.
of that going on every night.
Of course.
That's people. You're gonna lose. You're gonna take your lumps. And then we hope that will help develop that grit. And I guess in terms of, is there something from like then that mythological perspective on that development of the self through going through that losing process, or how are those lessons kind of given or learned in it from a mythological perspective?
That's an interesting question. I guess one of the things I immediately think about is, do you know that image of the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail? That's actually often, for whatever reason, associated with Hermes. And I heard this from so Carl Jung has this whole insane, I think it's available in book form, but really it's like a long essay on the relationship between alchemy and psychology. And he somehow draws the conclusion in there that the Ouroboros is the symbol for Hermes or Mercury. And man, I haven't even gotten into how alchemy is related to Hermeticism. That's a whole other rabbit hole that I could barely explain if you asked me to. But to me, that symbol is a depiction of, there's this curvature to the whole experience that eventually feeds back into itself, right? And it's like everybody, if they walk into that, jiu-jitsu school, regardless of like whether they want to be like an MMA champion or like a Gordon Ryan level dude or something, or they just want to be, they have whatever their more realistic goals are, to get to whatever that goal is, they need to be both the tail and the head, right? Like they have to be both the beginning and the end of that experience. And a huge part of that experience is losing. A huge part of that experience is like getting your ass kicked or feeling like you're helpless over and over and over again, so that you can reach the goal that you wanted in the first place. So there is something very trickstery about that, right? It's like, to get the thing you want, you have to eat the shit you don't want over and over and over and over and over again until you kind of get there. But usually, more often than not, you don't ever really, even if you look successful by other people's measures, like that. I can relate to that, being a creative that does this shit full time. Like, it never ends up, well, so far, maybe it will someday, but it never has looked exactly like I imagined it would look. So there's like something inherently trickstery about that, and you sort of either get, I think you either sort of get chewed up and spit out of that Ouroboros loop, or you just have to stay in it and like make your peace with it. And jiu-jitsu really seems like a great distillation of that experience, because it is so direct. Like, it's not as, the setup and the punchline is not as direct as a sport where it's literally like, oh, you want to win, do you? How about you lose 1,000 times first? Like, it's like it's right there,
Yeah, it's very, very much like that. And there's one idea I'd heard, which I think is Carl Jung, the circumambulation. I think, is that the pronunciation?
Probably.
Where it's like the circling around like the knowledge itself, and that you can't ever see it, but you can kind of, just by circling around it, you're getting an intimation of what it may be.
That sounds very plausible. I'm not, that riff isn't readily coming to me from him, but that definitely sounds like something he would talk about, because there is this very indirect mythological approach to knowledge that he has in general, and the best you can really do is try to, I've heard him talk about it this way, actually, of like drawing a circle around the thing, right? It's like, you don't know what the thing is, but if you draw, like the shadow is a classic example in Jungian psychology, is like, if I ask you about the thing of which you aren't aware in your own mind, the shadow, like, how do you even begin that process? Well, it's like, first, to your point, you have to sort of create an outline, right? You sort of have to create a way to interact with that. And that way usually ends up being mythological, or it ends up being through a symbol, something like that. So that does definitely make sense to me.
Yeah, because that's what I was thinking. A lot of, what it ends up becoming is you may want to learn this particular skill, but the circling around it is going to be a lot of losing, a lot of taking those lumps until you can finally perhaps get a grasp of that knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in your own experience with it, I know I know a little bit about your history, but not too much. But actually, would you mind just maybe people have heard this story many times on your podcast, but could you give me a brief overview of your story?
Sure. Yeah, so I myself got into martial arts probably fairly late in terms of, I think I was 24 when I got into it. I'd actually had I was attacked on the streets once walking home, and suffered pretty bad injuries in terms of head injuries and stuff like that, and I'd lost a lot of confidence in general day-to-day life, and a lot of anxiety over it. And then having seen mixed martial arts, I just knew it was something that I wanted to try and do and get into. And then luckily enough, there was a school nearby with a very experienced coach, Anthony Lang, who coached me for I guess almost 15 years or so, and something new, and then eventually do it for long enough, or probably I think I'd only done it for 6 months or so, but the opportunity came up to have a fight, and a mixed martial arts fight. I took that and won, and then eventually kept winning enough that I got some titles and stuff, and then also had a bunch of losses, so which were rough, but then moved into a coaching role and just kept training Muay Thai, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, until now it's just such a big part of my life, and has been for the last 15 years, and I found it so valuable in the lessons that it's given us, that that's where I'm now enjoying coaching as a way to hopefully help other people get those same benefits.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story, and it's crazy, like being able to experience the highs. I mean, man, I think every guy who's competitive romanticizes what that must feel like, being like somewhere with a packed crowd, and the feeling of like finishing a fight, like must just be like what can you vividly remember that feeling, or are you just so high on all of your endogenous
it's definitely a surreal feeling of that. It does seem, it's the things that you've seen on television and in movies, and then all of a sudden you're having it play out in your own life, and it is such an incredible adrenaline rush that it is an incredible high, that you feel that some people probably get addicted to it and just want to chase that feeling. Especially you see it when people maybe go on a bit too longer than they perhaps should have, trying to recreate the glory that they once had. And so it is that there is that allure to it that kind of draws you in, or if you never get to experience it, will certainly push you away.
Yeah. Did you have difficulty with ending it, not wanting to be what you just described, or did you find it?
Probably the last fight that I ever had, I probably shouldn't have taken, and in it I actually broke my arm in the middle of the fight and kept fighting for a bit longer until I got knocked out, and that was a good sign that it was time to hang it up. I remember the car ride to the hospital was a bit maybe it's time to start playing tennis was going through my mind.
Yeah. Damn, man. Yeah, that's I can't imagine, like, I don't think there's a way to experience higher highs egoically and lower lows egoically than that. It's so visceral and so real. Like, I remember, like I said, I really have been pretty religious about watching UFC for years, and I remember, like, I don't think I ever saw an ego destruction like from 100 to 0 more thoroughly than when Ronda Rousey got head kicked. Like, she was like, I remember her going on like talk shows months later and like breaking down talking about it. And it's like, and it's easy to sit there like watching it and be like, people get knocked out, they pick themselves up, they come back. But it's like, if you haven't been through that, I don't think you have any right.
And I mean, she never fully recovered from that.
No.
I mean, the one after it was, no media interviews, no anything, didn't want to talk about it at all, and then, suffered the other loss and then completely left the sport, where it was just, that was it, done. Which is, such a dramatic rise and fall so quickly that there's really nothing like it.
Yeah, and see, this is like the dark part of the trickster, because if there is like a trickster being that exists somewhere, some like archetypal trickster mind, he loves that. He loves to see the thing rise up and get really full of itself and think like it's going to last forever, and then watch that thing come crashing down. And that's like that's the dark part, is like that if we're participating in this energy, or this consciousness is participating in us somehow, like I think we want to believe that we're somehow gaining its favor, or we're somehow using that energy in ways that other people don't understand. But ultimately we would kind of be its playthings a little bit. We would kind of be its, in the same way that we watch a sport on TV and we get this cathartic, vicarious up and down through it. Like maybe it gets that through our emotions. Maybe it gets that through our collective psychological and emotional draining, from both the participant and the watchers. I don't know. I mean, this is where the rabbit hole gets really deep and unknowable. But I think it's like, because we can like over romanticize these things, or, in the same way I was talking about, like if you imagine yourself winning, well, you have to go through 1,000 losses to get to a win. I think we think about this whole process in a romantic way too, where we don't understand that if this thing that we've been talking about or talking around really exists, it probably really loves failure too. Like it probably really enjoys suffering to a certain extent, because it's novel, it's entertaining from a certain perspective. Like I don't think it's entertaining, but I think that in some weird way. Like by the way, I keep forgetting to ask you, where did you hear about the link between Hermes and wrestling?
That was just Googling and reading. So I think that is and it's on the Wikipedia page.
Oh, cool.
So that's where I heard about that, and then that got me thinking along those lines.
That makes sense, because I think that he's somehow like the patron god, maybe or deity of like the Olympics or sport in general. Obviously he's associated with like speed and running and like foot races, so probably other kinds of competition fall into that bucket. I don't know. Yeah.
And so do you think then, like with obviously competitive sports, the goal is, we design it just to win, always the goal is to win. But then, I mean, when we're designing these practices, really our goal is to learn and have fun. So there is that, even though in competitive sports we end up playing to win, we want to play to have fun and experiences those good emotions and learn through it like that, with that interplay between, the dark side and winning, which I'd categorize as the light side. Is there always going to be that draw to the darker side, the downfall, if you go down the competitive route?
I think it just depends. Like especially in a combat sport, it's hard to understand how it wouldn't come to that. Like you do see some guys with just like really good heads on their shoulders who seem to have like a really good perspective on the whole thing. But you think of like a Mike Tyson or something, who's just like had his ego built up to be like the ultimate destroyer, right? How can you skillfully step outside of that way of looking at yourself when you get knocked out, when you had I don't remember how many years he dominated for, but however many years it was, like, is there a way to not have a crashing and burning identity crisis, dark night of the soul on the other side of that. I don't know. Like that would be really difficult, I think, for the most well-adjusted person, let alone someone who came from a very troubled background like him, right? Who was basically just plucked out of an extremely troubled life with almost nothing positive in his life from the way that he talks about it, to being identified as like, you're special, and you're special because you can destroy. And as soon as his ability to destroy is gone, like, I don't know how you just gracefully bow out of it, like it's like, and I think a lot of people would deeply struggle with that, but I would never say it's impossible, because some people away in a commendable way, like maybe like a George St. Pierre, or like I don't know, I'm sure there are others, but
yeah, he is definitely my go-to example, I guess, is the ideal kind of martial arts figure, who seems to have just handled it all just with so much grace and dignity and just everything, and as well as the technical skill set to back it up. He's really just the ideal model for me. But I guess at some point, even he's going to get seen as the old guard that needs to be thrown away.
Yeah, but it's like he's always the one who, and I doubt he'll ever come back at this point, but the way that he went out, coming back for one fight and then like winning another belt, it preserves that myth a little bit. Like, I think that's the best you can do. I think the best you can do is be the extraordinarily rare case that goes out on top, and you let people wonder, well, what would have happened if you would have fought Khabib, or what would have happened if you would have fought this guy? But you're going to lose. Like, everybody's going to lose. And they even openly talk about that, I think. Like, both of those guys, Khabib and him, both talk about, like, no, like, I would have lost eventually. And, that's what you want to see, right? That you want to see me lose. Like, you want to see me come back and lose to some guy. And they're like, I'm not going to do that. And I think that's probably the best you can do. I don't know.
That's great. Well, Michael, I think, speaking of going out on top, I think that's a good spot to wrap things up. I've really enjoyed that conversation. Thank you so much. Something a bit different to kind of go down different avenues. And yeah, I think you're an excellent talker, and really enjoyed having you on. I hope you have too. If people would like to get in touch with you, I know Third Eye Drops is the podcast, but what else should they do to check you out?
Yeah, so I'm posting all the pods to YouTube these days. So youtube.com/Third Eye Drops. It's also on all podcast platforms. If you just look up Third Eye Drops, you'll find it. That's about it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, mate. I really appreciate it.
This is a lot of fun. I appreciate the invite too. And I likewise enjoyed having a chance to rap about some different fare. So happy to do it anytime, man.
Awesome. Thanks so much, mate. Have a good day.
You too, brother.
Cheers.
You have been listening to the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Until next time, you can visit sonnybrown.net to find out more ways to break it down.